Dynamite Kid is one of the most influential wrestlers ever. In an era of slow-moving giants and gimmicky characters, he was doing things that seemed physically impossible for a human body. But there's a reason modern wrestlers study his matches while modifying his approach. Dynamite's refusal to protect his body led to a wheelchair by age 40. His steroid use increased his weight by 40 pounds of muscle while destroying his organs. In 2018, he passed away on his 60th birthday. However, one question remains unanswered. Why is Dynamite Kid not in the Hall of Fame? In 1958, Thomas Billington was born in Golborne, Lancashire, a small mining town in northwest England known primarily for coal. This unremarkable place of identical brick houses was where men with blackened faces returned after grueling shifts underground. Billington's father worked in the coal mines like most local men, performing brutal work that broke bodies and shortened lives. Growing up in this environment taught young Tom lessons that couldn't be learned in any classroom. He saw firsthand what happened to men who spent their lives in the mines: the curved spines, the chronic coughs, the premature aging. The sight of his father coming home exhausted day after day made a deep impression on Tom. He didn't want that life for himself, but more importantly, he absorbed the values of his community: work hard, never complain, and never show weakness. Fighting was in his blood. His grandfather had been a bare-knuckle fighting champion, while his father and uncle had both boxed. Tom wasn't a big kid. He would never grow beyond 5 feet 8, but he was naturally athletic and surprisingly strong for his size. More importantly, he had something that couldn't be measured: a burning intensity and willingness to endure pain that set him apart from his peers. Tom's first serious athletic pursuit was boxing, where he showed natural talent. The local gym became his second home, a place where he could channel his energy and develop his coordination. His quick hands and explosive movement made him stand out. But it was a chance encounter at that same gym that would change the course of his life. The boxing gym also hosted a wrestling school run by Ted Betley, a respected veteran of the British wrestling scene. Betley noticed the intense young boxer and saw something special in his movement and attitude. He suggested Tom try wrestling, and from the moment Tom stepped onto the mat, it was clear he had found his calling. "That kid picked things up faster than anyone I've ever trained," Betley would later say. The technical aspects of wrestling came naturally to Tom. Where other trainees struggled with chain wrestling and complex sequences, he absorbed them like a sponge. But what truly set him apart was his intensity. Even in training, Tom approached wrestling with a seriousness that bordered on obsession. He didn't just want to perform moves, he wanted them to look real. Betley's training was old school and physically demanding. Students learned holds and counter holds until they became second nature. They conditioned their bodies through endless squats, push-ups, and bridge exercises that strengthened the neck. There were no shortcuts, and Betley didn't tolerate complainers. It was the perfect environment for someone raised in a mining community where toughness was valued above all else. An important influence during these early years was Tom's cousin, Davey Boy Smith, who was 3 years younger but similarly passionate about wrestling. The two trained together under Betley, and their practice matches became legendary for their intensity. Neither wanted to appear weak in front of the other, so what should have been simple training exercises often turned into competitive battles that left both nursing bruises and bloody noses. These matches with Davey Boy helped shape what would become Tom's signature style. While most British wrestlers of the era worked a methodical, hold-based style focused on technical proficiency, Tom added elements that weren't common on the UK scene: faster pace, higher impact moves, and an intensity that made everything look dangerously real. He wasn't content to simply apply a hold. He wanted to make the audience believe he was genuinely trying to hurt his opponent. By his late teens, Tom was working professional matches throughout Britain. Promoters initially didn't know what to make of him. He was small by wrestling standards, but he worked with such vicious intensity that audiences couldn't help but react. His dropkicks were faster and higher than anything British fans had seen before. His snap suplex had perfect form and frightening impact. Even simple moves like a backdrop or a body slam looked devastating when Tom performed them. It was during this period that he earned the nickname that would define his career. After watching the young wrestler's explosive style and lightning-fast moves, a promoter dubbed him the Dynamite Kid. The name fit perfectly. Tom Billington was compact but devastating, capable of explosive impact that belied his size. Despite his growing reputation on the British scene, Tom knew his opportunities were limited in his home country. British wrestling in the 1970s was heavily regulated by joint promotions, which controlled television exposure and top bookings. The style was very traditional, and the pay was modest at best. For someone with Tom's ambition, staying in Britain meant accepting a ceiling on both his creative freedom and his earning potential. When Tom heard about opportunities in Stu Hart's Stampede Wrestling promotion in Calgary, Canada, he made the biggest decision of his young life. At just 20 years old, he left behind everything familiar, his hometown, his family, and the British wrestling scene, to venture across the Atlantic to an unknown territory. He had no guarantees, just confidence in his abilities and a determination to make a name for himself. What Tom Billington carried with him to Canada was shaped entirely by where he came from. The mining town of Goulburn had taught him to be tough, to endure pain without complaint, and to work harder than everyone else. Ted Betley had given him a solid technical foundation and instilled in him a respect for wrestling as a craft. His matches with Davey Boy Smith had developed his intensity and competitiveness. Together, these influences created a wrestler unlike any other, technically brilliant, physically explosive, and uncompromising in his approach to the business. That uncompromising nature would be both his greatest strength and, ultimately, his downfall. The same intensity that made him revolutionary in the ring made him unwilling to protect his body or moderate his style, even when the physical toll became apparent. The same toughness that helped him overcome his small stature made him resistant to changing course when his health was clearly failing. The Dynamite Kid was forged in coal country, and like the mineral itself, he would burn brilliantly but at tremendous cost. With his raw talent and toughness established, Dynamite Kid was about to find the perfect place to develop his revolutionary style. When Tom Billington arrived in Calgary in 1978, he stepped into what would become the perfect laboratory for his developing style. Stampede Wrestling wasn't like other territories in North America. Run by Stu Hart, father of Bret and Owen Hart, this promotion had built a reputation for showcasing a harder-hitting, more realistic brand of wrestling. The fans in Calgary weren't satisfied with simple character work and basic moves. They wanted wrestling that looked like a legitimate contest, and Stampede gave them exactly that. The heart of Stampede Wrestling's training system was the infamous Hart Dungeon, literally the basement of Stu Hart's house. This unassuming space became legendary in wrestling circles for the brutal training sessions that occurred there. Stu Hart, a former amateur wrestler with incredible technical knowledge, personally trained select wrestlers by applying holds that pushed them to their absolute limits. Screams from the dungeon became so common that the Hart children barely noticed them anymore. "My dad didn't believe in taking it easy on anyone," Bret Hart later recalled. "If you trained with Stu Hart, you either got tough or you quit wrestling altogether." The training wasn't just physically demanding. It was legitimately painful. Stu would apply holds until his students were on the verge of passing out, teaching them the exact pressure points and leverage needed to make wrestling holds effective. This wasn't fake wrestling. This was genuine submission training that prepared wrestlers for the physical demands of the business. Dynamite Kid thrived in this environment. Despite being smaller than many of his peers, his natural toughness and refusal to show pain earned Stu's respect immediately. While some wrestlers complained about the training methods or tried to avoid Stu's notorious stretching sessions, Dynamite actively sought them out. He understood that this technical knowledge would give him an edge that size alone couldn't match. The Stampede style emphasized legitimate wrestling techniques applied with enough force to look real without causing serious injury, at least in theory. As Dynamite absorbed these lessons, he began adding his own twist. Where other wrestlers might apply a hold with controlled pressure, Dynamite would push it just a bit further, making his opponent's pain reaction completely authentic. His strikes, rather than being pulled at the last second, often made genuine contact. This approach quickly earned him a reputation among other wrestlers as someone who worked stiff. In the ring, Dynamite was developing something revolutionary, a hybrid style that combined British technical wrestling with explosive speed and high-flying moves rarely seen in North America. His drop kicks were higher and faster than anything Calgary audiences had seen before. When he launched himself from the top rope, he did so with perfect form and pinpoint accuracy. In an era where flying moves were often reserved for masked Mexican wrestlers, seeing a young British wrestler execute perfect diving headbutts and flying body presses was shocking. What made Dynamite's aerial arsenal even more impressive was his size. High-flying moves were typically performed by the smallest wrestlers on the card, men who weighed 175 pounds or less. At a solid 195 to 200 pounds of dense muscle, Dynamite was substantially heavier, yet moved with the grace and agility of someone much lighter. This combination of power, technical skill, and aerial ability made him unique in professional wrestling. The Stampede Wrestling fans quickly recognized they were witnessing something special. Attendance numbers rose when Dynamite was on the card. Even in a promotion known for quality wrestling, his matches stood out. Each week, he seemed to add new wrinkles to his performances: a different type of suplex, a more impactful way to deliver a knee drop, or a counter to a common hold that no one had seen before. It was during this period that Dynamite began his legendary series of matches with Bret Hart. The two couldn't have been more different in their approaches. Bret was methodical, technically flawless, and worked a safer style that protected both himself and his opponents. Dynamite was explosive, intense, and pushed the boundaries of safety with every match. Yet together, they created magic in the ring that Calgary wrestling fans still talk about decades later. Dynamite Kid was the best wrestler I ever worked with, Bret Hart would later say, a significant compliment from someone widely regarded as one of the greatest technical wrestlers in history. He made everything look so real. When he hit you, it looked like it hurt because, well, it did hurt. But he was so good that even when he was working stiff, you rarely got injured. He had that much control. Their matches followed a similar pattern. Dynamite's aggressive offense would control the early portions, with Bret making comebacks through superior strategy and careful targeting of weaknesses. What made these encounters special was the seamless way they blended styles. Technical wrestling giving way to high spots, power moves transitioning into submission attempts. They told complete stories in the ring without saying a word. These matches were changing perceptions about what smaller wrestlers could accomplish. Fans who came expecting to see the bigger men like Bad News Allen or Archie Gouldy as the main attractions often left talking about the Dynamite Hart match instead. Promoters took notice too. In a business where 6-foot-plus heavyweights had always been the drawing cards, a 5'8" Dynamo was proving that skill and intensity could be just as marketable as size. Dynamite's success in Stampede wasn't just about his in-ring performances. He was developing a character that perfectly matched his wrestling style. He rarely spoke at length, letting his actions communicate for him. He didn't need elaborate costumes or gimmicks. His intensity was authentic. When he glared at an opponent or the crowd, there was genuine menace behind his eyes. This wasn't a performer playing a role. This was someone who genuinely seemed capable of hurting people for sport. By 1980, Dynamite Kid had become Stampede Wrestling's biggest star. He held the British Commonwealth Mid-Heavyweight Championship multiple times and drew consistent crowds. His matches were studied by younger wrestlers coming into the territory who tried to emulate his style and precision. Few could match his combination of technical skill and reckless abandon. Stampede Wrestling had become the perfect laboratory for Dynamite Kid to develop his revolutionary approach. The promotion's emphasis on realistic combat gave him the foundation. Stu Hart's technical training provided the tools. The competitive locker room full of talented workers pushed him to constantly innovate. The receptive Calgary crowds rewarded his efforts with growing popularity. The transformation was remarkable. The young wrestler who had arrived from England with raw talent and toughness had evolved into perhaps the most complete performer in the business. He could work technical matches that satisfied purists. He could perform high-flying moves that thrilled casual fans. Most importantly, he brought an intensity and realism to his performances that made everything he did completely believable. Dynamite Kid had found his wrestling home in Calgary, but his ambitions were growing. Stories about his performances had reached Japan, where a different style of wrestling was valued, one that might appreciate his hard-hitting approach even more than North American audiences. Bruce Hart, who had connections with New Japan Pro Wrestling, helped arrange a tour for Dynamite in 1980. While Calgary had given Dynamite Kid the technical foundation, it was in Japan where his style would truly change wrestling forever. When Dynamite Kid first stepped off the plane in Japan in 1980, he couldn't have known he was about to change wrestling forever. New Japan Pro. Wrestling had invited him based on reports of his performances in Calgary, but they weren't quite sure what to make of him. At 5 feet 8 inches and just under 200 pounds, he wasn't particularly impressive physically by Japanese standards. The junior heavyweight division in Japan was already established, but it was often treated as a warm-up for the heavyweights who were the real stars. What Japanese promoters and fans quickly discovered was that Dynamite Kid wasn't just another foreign wrestler coming to collect a paycheck. His style was unlike anything they had seen before. While Japanese wrestling already had a reputation for being stiffer and more realistic than American wrestling, Dynamite took things to another level. His dropkicks landed with frightening impact. His suplexes weren't just technically perfect, they were delivered with such force that audiences gasped. Even simple moves like a body slam or a backdrop looked devastating when Dynamite performed them. For the first year, Dynamite worked against various opponents in the junior heavyweight division. These matches were well received, but the true revelation came in April 1981, when New Japan decided to pair him with a wrestler who would become his perfect foil, Satoru Sayama, better known as Tiger Mask. Tiger Mask was a character based on a popular Japanese anime and manga series. Sayama, who wore the distinctive tiger-striped mask, had trained in Mexico and brought a lucha libre-influenced style to Japan. Where Dynamite was all power and intensity, Tiger Mask was agility and grace. Dynamite threw devastating strikes and suplexes. Tiger Mask countered with lightning-fast kicks and acrobatic moves. On paper, their styles shouldn't have meshed well together. In practice, they created magic. Their first match took place on April 23, 1981, at Korakuen Hall in Tokyo. From the opening lockup, audiences knew they were seeing something different. The pace was faster than standard matches of the era. The moves were executed with a crispness rarely seen. Most importantly, there was a competitive fire that made the match feel like a genuine athletic contest, rather than a predetermined exhibition. Within minutes of the first bell, the crowd was standing, recalled one New Japan official who was present that night. By the end, they were making noise I had never heard in Korakuen Hall before. Everyone knew immediately that this was special. The match ended with Tiger Mask victorious, but the result hardly mattered. What mattered was that two wrestlers had just shown a glimpse of what wrestling could be when traditional limitations were ignored. They hadn't just had a good match, they had opened a door to an entirely new style of professional wrestling. Over the next 2 years, Dynamite and Tiger Mask would face each other in a series of matches that continuously raised the bar. Each encounter introduced moves and sequences that had never been seen in professional wrestling before. They weren't content to simply repeat what had worked previously. They were determined to innovate with every match. The innovation was most apparent in their aerial moves. Wrestling had seen top rope maneuvers before, but never with the precision and impact that these two delivered. Dynamite's diving headbutt from the top rope had perfect form and devastating impact. Tiger Mask's space-flying tiger drop, a moonsault body block from the top rope to the floor, was something audiences had never seen before. When Dynamite executed a perfect tope suicida, Japanese fans were left stunned by the reckless abandonment of a wrestler his size. Their matches featured snap suplexes with variations that expanded the wrestling vocabulary. The German suplex, the belly-to-back suplex, the vertical suplex, Dynamite executed them all with technical perfection and added his own twist to each. When most wrestlers delivered a suplex, the opponent took the bump and the move was complete. When Dynamite delivered a suplex, he maintained a tight waistlock, rolled through, and hit a second or even third suplex in succession. This combination of technical skill and power was revolutionary. Perhaps most impressive were the intricate reversal sequences that defined their matches. Wrestling had long featured basic reversals, a wrist lock countered into an arm drag, for instance. Dynamite and Tiger Mask took this concept and expanded it exponentially. They would chain together 6, 7, sometimes 10 reversals in a sequence that flowed seamlessly, with neither wrestler maintaining control for more than a second before the other countered. These sequences weren't choreographed dances. They were athletic chess matches that showcased both men's technical brilliance. The cultural impact in Japan was immediate. Wrestling magazines devoted multiple pages to analyzing their matches. Television ratings spiked whenever they faced each other. Most importantly, their style began influencing other wrestlers on the roster, who recognized that this approach connected with audiences in a profound way. Japanese wrestling fans had always appreciated technical skill, but the Dynamite Tiger Mask series elevated their expectations to a new level. Suddenly, simple headlocks and basic moves weren't enough. Audiences wanted to see the innovation, athleticism, and realism that these two brought to every match. Their bouts became the standard against which other junior heavyweight matches were judged. What made these matches particularly significant was how they were studied by younger wrestlers. In dojos across Japan, trainees would watch tapes of Dynamite versus Tiger Mask, analyzing the techniques, timing, and psychology. These matches didn't just entertain, they educated an entire generation of wrestlers about what was possible in the ring. While the immediate impact was felt in Japan, the influence of these matches would eventually spread worldwide. Wrestling tape traders in North America and Europe passed VHS copies around, exposing Western audiences to a style they had never seen before. Young wrestlers like Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and Dean Malenko studied these tapes obsessively, incorporating elements into their own performances. The series of matches between Dynamite Kid and Tiger Mask established a new standard for junior heavyweight wrestling that was decades ahead of its time. They proved that smaller wrestlers could deliver main-event quality performances that connected with audiences on a visceral level. They showed that technical wrestling, when performed with sufficient intensity and innovation, could be just as exciting as any power-based style. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that wrestling could blend athleticism, storytelling, and realism in a way that elevated it from simple entertainment to something approaching art. Their matches weren't just about determining a winner. They were physical narratives that captured the imagination and emotional investment of everyone watching. By 1983, when their final match took place, Dynamite Kid and Tiger Mask had forever changed what wrestling fans expected from in-ring performances. The junior heavyweight division in Japan was no longer an afterthought. It was often the most anticipated part of the card. Smaller wrestlers were no longer limited to opening matches. They could legitimately headline shows. With his reputation cemented in Japan, the wrestling world was watching, including Vince McMahon's expanding WWF empire. By 1984, the professional wrestling landscape in America was changing dramatically. Vince McMahon Jr. had purchased the World Wrestling Federation from his father and was aggressively expanding nationwide, signing top talent from territories across the country. His vision for wrestling was clear: bigger, louder, more colorful, and heavily focused on larger-than-life characters rather than in-ring action. Into this increasingly cartoonish world stepped Dynamite Kid and his cousin Davey Boy Smith, packaged together as the British Bulldogs. The pair made their WWF television debut on August 29, 1984, teaming with Bret Hart to defeat Iron Mike Sharpe and Troy Alexander. This match, which aired on the storied Maple Leaf Garden broadcast, offered fans their first glimpse of what would soon become a revolution in the tag team division. The contrast between the Bulldogs and the WWF's developing product couldn't have been starker. While the company was moving toward neon colors, outlandish gimmicks, and simple, crowd-pleasing moves, the Bulldogs brought an intensity and realism that felt almost out of place. They didn't have elaborate costumes or wild personas. They were presented simply as tough, no-nonsense wrestlers from England who could legitimately hurt their opponents. Their in-ring style was equally distinct. In an era when many WWF matches consisted of basic punches, kicks, and maybe a body slam before a simple finisher, the Bulldogs were executing crisp suplexes, precise strikes, and flying moves rarely seen in American wrestling. Dynamite's perfect diving headbutt from the top rope became their signature, a move that looked so devastating that audiences couldn't help but react. What made the team truly special was their complementary skills. Davey Boy Smith was the power half of the team. At 6 feet 0 and a muscular 260 pounds, he could press slam opponents with ease and had surprising agility for his size. Dynamite provided the technical brilliance and intensity, moving at a pace few could match and making every strike look deadly. Together, they created a complete package that even the increasingly entertainment-focused WWF couldn't ignore. The Bulldogs quickly rose through the tag team ranks, facing established teams like the Dream Team, Greg Valentine and Brutus Beefcake, and the Hart Foundation, Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart. These matches showcased a level of wrestling that stood apart from much of the WWF's product. Where most matches of the era were designed to highlight character and spectacle over wrestling quality, the Bulldogs' matches felt like athletic contests with genuine stakes. Their battles with the Hart Foundation were particularly noteworthy. Both teams had come from Stampede Wrestling and shared a similar foundation in technical wrestling. However, they approached matches differently. The Hart Foundation worked a methodical, strategic style, while the Bulldogs brought a faster pace and higher impact. When these teams collided, the result was tag team wrestling at its finest. Technical exchanges, precise timing, and an intensity that made audiences believe in the competition. Team Championship. The presence of rock star Ozzy Osbourne in their corner added a touch of the WWF's signature spectacle, but the match itself showcased what made the Bulldogs special: their combination of power, speed, and technical skill that no other team could match. This championship victory represented a significant moment in WWF history. In a company increasingly built around characters like Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, and the Junkyard Dog, the Bulldogs succeeded based primarily on their in-ring abilities. They weren't the most charismatic performers, they didn't cut memorable promos, and they didn't have flashy gimmicks. They simply wrestled better than anyone else, and fans responded to the authenticity they brought to the ring. The Bulldogs' influence extended beyond their own matches. Other wrestlers, seeing the positive reaction to their style, began incorporating more technical elements into their performances. Even in the character-driven WWF, in-ring quality began to matter more. The tag team division in particular saw a noticeable improvement in match quality during this period, as teams worked to keep pace with the standard the Bulldogs had established. But behind this success, a darker story was unfolding. The physical toll of Dynamite's high-impact style was beginning to show. While his matches in Japan and Stampede had been hard-hitting, the WWF's grueling schedule meant wrestling 250 to 300 days a year with little time for his body to recover. Each perfect diving headbutt, each crisp suplex, each stiff strike was gradually breaking down his body. The situation came to a head in December 1986 during a tag team match against Don Morocco and Bob Orton Jr. During the match, Dynamite suffered a severe back injury that would foreshadow his eventual decline. The injury was so significant that the WWF had to use a rotating cast of wrestlers, including Roddy Piper, Junkyard Dog, and Billy Jack Haynes, to team with Davey Boy Smith and defend the Tag Team Championship while Billington recovered. When Dynamite returned to action, he wasn't the same performer. The explosive speed that had defined his style was diminished. The crisp execution of his technical moves lacked the precision fans had come to expect. Most notably, he began to rely more heavily on his still impressive upper body strength rather than the all-around athleticism that had made him revolutionary. Yet, even at reduced capacity, Dynamite Kid remained one of the best wrestlers in the WWF. His technical knowledge and intensity compensated for his declining physical abilities. The Bulldogs continued to have quality matches, though they eventually lost the Tag Team Championships back to the Hart Foundation in January 1987. For wrestling purists who valued in-ring action over character, the British Bulldogs represented an island of credibility in the increasingly cartoonish WWF landscape. While much of the company's product was moving toward broader entertainment with less emphasis on the athletic component of wrestling, the Bulldogs reminded fans that professional wrestling could still look and feel like a legitimate contest. Their legacy in the WWF went beyond championships and famous matches. They proved that technical wrestling could connect with mainstream American audiences when presented with sufficient intensity and athleticism. They showed that smaller wrestlers, in Dynamite's case, could be just as compelling as the giants who typically dominated the promotion. Perhaps most importantly, they maintained a link to wrestling's more serious past, even as the business evolved toward entertainment. But behind the success, a darker story was unfolding, one that would ultimately cut short Dynamite Kid's groundbreaking career. By 1985, the physical toll of Dynamite Kid's revolutionary style was becoming impossible to ignore. The man who had redefined what a smaller wrestler could accomplish in the ring was starting to break down. Each crisp suplex, each perfect diving headbutt, each stiff strike was exacting a price his body couldn't continue to pay. Watching footage from his early career in Stampede and comparing it to his WWF matches, you could see subtle changes, small adjustments in his movement, brief hesitations before high-impact moves, the occasional grimace quickly hidden from the audience. What wasn't visible to fans was the transformation happening to his body behind the scenes. Dynamite Kid had begun using anabolic steroids, a practice widely accepted in wrestling during this era. The effects were dramatic and immediate. The 170-pound technical wrestler who had first arrived in Stampede Wrestling had transformed into a 210-pound powerhouse with muscles bulging from his compact frame. This 30 to 40-pound increase in muscle mass gave him an impressive physique that helped him stand out in the increasingly body-conscious WWF. But this physical transformation came at a tremendous cost. The added weight placed enormous strain on his joints and ligaments, body parts that were already taking punishment from his high-impact style. His knees, which absorbed the impact of countless dropkicks and flying headbutts, began to deteriorate. His back, stressed by suplexes and slams performed night after night, started showing signs of serious damage. The human body simply wasn't designed to absorb the kind of punishment Dynamite was putting himself through, especially while carrying unnaturally large muscle mass on his 5'8" frame. As the injuries mounted, Dynamite turned to another common solution in 1980s wrestling: painkillers. What began as a way to get through occasional bad nights quickly evolved into dependency. The pills allowed him to continue performing at a high level despite mounting injuries, but they merely masked the pain rather than addressing the underlying damage. This dangerous combination, steroids to build his body beyond its natural limits and painkillers to numb the resulting pain, created a cycle that was destroying him from the inside out. Most wrestlers facing this physical decline would have adjusted their style. They would have removed the most punishing moves from their repertoire, slowed their pace, or found ways to protect their bodies. Dynamite refused. His identity as a wrestler was built around his intensity and physicality. To work a safer style meant, in his mind, to become an entirely different performer. Despite explicit warnings from doctors about the damage he was inflicting on himself, he continued pushing his body to its absolute limits. Dynamite had seriously damaged his back, an injury that would have ended most wrestling careers immediately. Yet somehow, he returned to the ring. After months of recovery, he was back performing with the British Bulldogs, though noticeably diminished. His movement was restricted. The crispness that had defined his style was fading. The explosiveness that made his offense so compelling was clearly compromised. But still, he refused to fully adapt. He continued attempting flying headbutts and impact-heavy moves despite the obvious pain they caused him. This stubborn refusal to adjust wasn't unique to Dynamite Kid. The culture of the 1980s wrestling locker rooms actively encouraged this self-destructive mindset. Wrestlers who complained about injuries were labeled as weak. Those who modified their styles to protect their health were seen as soft. The unwritten code demanded that performers push through pain, regardless of long-term consequences. In this environment, Dynamite's determination to maintain his hard-hitting style wasn't seen as foolish. It was celebrated as toughness and dedication to the craft. The road schedule made everything worse. In Japan or Stampede, Dynamite might work a few matches per week, giving his body time to recover between performances. In the WWF's grueling schedule, he was wrestling 25 to 28 days per month, sometimes twice on weekends. His body simply never had time to heal. Minor injuries became chronic conditions. Nagging pain became constant agony. The cycle of steroids and painkillers intensified as he tried desperately to keep his body functioning. Throughout this period, questions lingered about whether the physical price was worth the innovation Dynamite brought to wrestling. Was revolutionizing what smaller wrestlers could accomplish in the ring worth the destruction of his own body? Was expanding wrestling's technical vocabulary worth the pain he endured daily? Was influencing a generation of future performers worth sacrificing his long-term health? These weren't questions Dynamite himself seemed to consider. He pushed forward, seemingly unconcerned with what his body would be like when his career eventually ended. By 1988, as his WWF run was coming to a close, Dynamite Kid's physical condition had deteriorated dramatically. His muscular frame had begun to shrink as injuries prevented consistent training. His movement in the ring was noticeably stiff. The performer who had once moved with unmatched speed and precision was now visibly struggling through matches. Yet his influence on wrestling was reaching its peak, with younger wrestlers studying his matches and incorporating elements of his style into their own performances. The cruel irony wasn't lost on those close to him. Just as Dynamite Kid's approach to wrestling was being validated, as promoters recognized that smaller, more technical wrestlers could connect with audiences and draw money, his body was breaking down. The very style that made him revolutionary was preventing him from enjoying the fruits of that revolution. His innovations would live on through others while he suffered the consequences of being the pioneer. His daughter Bronwyn once recalled a rare, vulnerable moment when, facing his declining health, Dynamite told her, "I'm sorry." It was, she said, the only time he ever apologized, a brief acknowledgement of the price his family would pay for his physical sacrifices in the ring. This physical decline represented only one aspect of Dynamite Kid's complicated legacy. His body was failing him due to his uncompromising approach to wrestling, but there was another troubling dimension to his story emerging behind the scenes. The same intensity that made him brilliant in the ring was manifesting in darker ways outside of it. The combination of physical pain, steroid use, and the pressure of maintaining his position was affecting his personality and behavior toward those around him. While his body was failing him, another side of Dynamite Kid was emerging, one that complicated his legacy beyond the ring. Behind the explosive ring style that revolutionized wrestling, Tom Billington carried a reputation that made fellow wrestlers both admire and fear him. In the locker rooms of the 1980s, the Dynamite Kid wasn't just known for his technical brilliance. He was equally famous for his unpredictable behavior and harsh treatment of others. Wrestlers would often speak of him in hushed tones, acknowledging his undeniable talent while sharing stories of encounters they hoped to avoid. The wrestling business of the 1980s created the perfect environment for this behavior to flourish. Locker rooms weren't the professionally managed spaces they are today. They were often described as dark places full of violence and inflated egos, where toughness was valued above all else. In this world, showing weakness could destroy your career. Standing up for yourself, even through extreme measures, earned respect. The combination of constant physical pain, rampant steroid use, and the pressure to maintain a tough image created a powder keg of emotions and impulses. Dynamite's infamous ribs, wrestling terminology for pranks, went far beyond harmless fun. While practical jokes were common in wrestling culture, Dynamite's versions often crossed into cruel territory. Fellow wrestlers described him as having a mean streak that manifested in elaborate schemes to humiliate others. One particularly troubling incident involved an up-and-coming wrestler whose drink was spiked with a strong sedative. After the young wrestler passed out, Dynamite and Davey Boy Smith allegedly invaded his hotel room to urinate in his bag and shave off his eyebrows. This wasn't playful mischief. It was calculated humiliation. These weren't isolated incidents. Dynamite established a pattern of targeting those with less power or influence in the locker room. The intensity that made him so compelling in the ring, his refusal to compromise, his willingness to inflict and absorb pain, translated to a backstage persona that many found difficult to deal with. Younger wrestlers, especially, learned to tread carefully around him, never knowing what might trigger his temper. Perhaps the most famous backstage incident involved Jacques Rougeau, one half of the tag team, the Fabulous Rougeaus. The situation began with Dynamite, confronting Rougeau over a perceived slight regarding his wrestling gear. What started as a verbal confrontation escalated when Dynamite allegedly struck Rougeau. The incident might have ended there, as many backstage altercations did, but Rougeau wasn't willing to let it go. Sometime later, Rougeau approached Dynamite in the locker room with a roll of quarters wrapped in his fist and struck him in the face, shattering several of Dynamite's teeth. The fallout from this incident contributed directly to the British Bulldogs' departure from the WWF. While they weren't fired outright, the tense atmosphere created by the confrontation made their position uncomfortable. The Bulldogs ultimately gave their notice and finished their WWF run at the Survivor Series in November 1988. This marked a significant turning point in Dynamite's career. What should have been his prime years in the biggest wrestling company in America were cut short, in part because of his own behavior. Fellow wrestlers often spoke about the stark contrast between Dynamite's technical brilliance and his personal conduct. Bret Hart, who had tremendous respect for Dynamite's in-ring ability, noted in his autobiography that the Bulldogs weren't as good after they got bigger, becoming more cumbersome and losing their explosiveness. This observation pointed to another aspect of Dynamite's self-destructive tendencies: his willingness to sacrifice long-term performance for short-term physical intimidation through steroid use. The darkness in Dynamite's personality extended beyond the wrestling world and into his personal relationships. His wife, Michelle, endured years of verbal abuse that left her feeling like a failure. The situation reached a breaking point when she gave him a one-way ticket to England, hoping to end their troubled relationship. His response was terrifying. He allegedly threatened her with a shotgun. This wasn't the behavior of a wrestling character playing a role. It was a troubled man whose intensity had evolved into something dangerous. What created this darkness in Dynamite Kid? The roots likely stretched back to his upbringing in the tough mining community of Goulburn. Growing up in an environment where physical toughness was necessary for survival, where showing weakness wasn't an option, shaped his worldview from an early age. The wrestling business, with its emphasis on projecting strength and hiding vulnerability, reinforced these tendencies rather than helping him address them. The physical pain he endured daily from his high-impact style surely contributed as well. Living with constant pain changes a person. It shortens tempers, clouds judgment, and makes normal interactions more difficult. The painkillers he took to manage this discomfort likely affected his mood and decision-making. The steroids that transformed his body were known to increase aggression and volatility in many users. This combination, psychological baggage from childhood, physical pain, prescription painkillers, and steroid use, created a perfect storm for behavioral issues. Rare moments of self-awareness suggested Dynamite understood, at some level, the impact of his actions. The consequences for Dynamite's career were significant. His reputation limited his opportunities, particularly in the American wrestling scene. Promoters who valued locker room harmony became hesitant to book him despite his undeniable talent. Bridges burned through years of difficult behavior couldn't be rebuilt. Potential mentorship roles teaching younger wrestlers his revolutionary style never materialized. The same intensity that made him a wrestling genius ultimately isolated him from the business he had helped transform. Dynamite's personal demons created a legacy far more complicated than his in-ring brilliance alone would suggest. Wrestling historians and fans face the difficult task of reconciling the revolutionary performer with the troubled man. His technical innovations changed wrestling forever, inspiring generations of performers who studied his matches. Yet his personal behavior served as a cautionary tale about the dark side of the business. The toll it takes not just on bodies but on minds and relationships. For those who knew him personally, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. The same man who could execute the most beautiful, precise wrestling moves could also act with shocking cruelty. The performer who showed such control in the ring often seemed to lack it outside the squared circle. The wrestler who changed the business forever couldn't sustain the relationships in his personal life. As his body and personal relationships deteriorated, Dynamite Kid's career entered its final, painful chapter. After leaving the WWF in late 1988, Dynamite Kid returned to familiar territory. Stampede Wrestling in Calgary welcomed him back, and Japanese promotions still valued his name recognition. But fans who remembered the explosive performer from just a few years earlier noticed something different. The crisp, precise movements that defined his style had become noticeably stiffer. The wrestler who once moved like lightning now seemed to be fighting against his own body with every step. His body was ravaged by years of wrestling, noted one observer who witnessed his matches during this period. The physical decline wasn't subtle. His muscle mass had begun to shrink, the result of being unable to maintain his previous training regimen due to constant pain. His timing, once perfect, now occasionally faltered. Most telling were the modifications to his moveset. The highest impact techniques that had made him famous were appearing less frequently in his matches. Yet stubbornly, almost defiantly, Dynamite refused to completely abandon the style that had broken his body. He still attempted diving headbutts, despite doctors warning him about further damage to his spine. He still delivered stiff kicks and strikes, even as his mobility decreased. He still pushed for realistic-looking matches, even when a safer approach might have extended his career. This determination to maintain his standards despite his physical limitations spoke to both his dedication to his craft and his inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Japanese audiences who had witnessed his revolutionary matches with Tiger Mask a decade earlier saw the starkest contrast. In those classic bouts, Dynamite had moved with unmatched speed and precision, executing flying moves that defied what seemed possible for a wrestler his size. Now, those same audiences watched as he struggled through matches, relying more on his still considerable striking ability and technical knowledge to compensate for his diminished mobility. Each match during this period extracted a terrible price. What fans saw was only part of the story. Behind the scenes, Dynamite's post-match routine became increasingly focused on simply recovering enough to perform the next night. Ice baths, painkillers, and whatever else might temporarily relieve his suffering became essential parts of his daily existence. The physical decline accelerated as his body, already damaged from years of punishment, continued breaking down with no chance to properly heal. His final run in Japan showed just how far his physical abilities had deteriorated. Matches that would have been classics in his prime, his movements were increasingly labored. The explosive quality that had earned him his nickname was virtually gone. Yet despite this decline, glimpses of his genius remained. A perfectly executed suplex here, a crisp technical sequence there, brief reminders of the wrestler who had changed the business. By the mid-1990s, Dynamite's condition had become so severe that continuing his career was no longer possible. His back issues had progressed to the point where even basic movement caused extreme pain. His knees, damaged by thousands of drop kicks and flying headbutts, could no longer support his weight reliably. The cumulative effect of years of steroid use had enlarged his heart dangerously. Doctors delivered a stark warning. If he did not stop taking steroids and painkillers, he would die. The end came in 1996, when at just 38 years old, an age when many wrestlers are still in their prime, Dynamite Kid was forced to retire from the profession that had defined his life. The finality of this moment was difficult to process for someone whose identity had been so completely wrapped up in his physical abilities. From childhood, he had been defined by what his body could do in a wrestling ring. Now, that chapter was permanently closed. What followed was even more devastating. Shortly after his retirement, Dynamite lost the use of his left leg. His mobility decreased rapidly, and eventually, he was confined to a wheelchair. He was told he would never be able to walk again, according to those close to the situation. The man who had once performed aerial moves with perfect grace was now unable to stand unassisted. The contrast between the Dynamite Kid in his prime and the man he had become was heartbreaking for those who remembered his revolutionary performances. A series of strokes further limited his mobility and quality of life in the years that followed. Each new health crisis seemed to strip away another piece of his independence. For someone who had built his life around physical autonomy and strength, this progressive loss of function was particularly cruel. The wrestler who had refused to acknowledge physical limitations in the ring was now defined by them in his daily life. The financial impact of his physical decline was equally severe. Unlike today's top wrestlers, performers of Dynamite's era rarely had significant savings or insurance to cover extended health crises. Medical bills mounted quickly, creating financial pressure that he was ill-equipped to handle. Eventually, he was forced to sell his house and move in with relatives, unable to support himself independently. In his autobiography, Pure Dynamite, published in 1999, he offered a brutally honest assessment of his career and life choices. He detailed both his triumphs and his regrets, providing a sobering look at the darker side of professional wrestling. He openly admitted to many of the terrible things he did, offering no excuses for his behavior. The book served as both a celebration of his revolutionary impact on wrestling and a warning about the costs of pursuing excellence at any price. The years that followed brought additional health complications. His enlarged heart, a common side effect of steroid abuse, created ongoing cardiac issues. His mobility continued to decrease. Financial struggles remained a constant concern. The physical specimen who had once revolutionized wrestling now found himself dependent on others for basic needs. Kid's story reached its conclusion on December 5, 2018, his 60th birthday. He passed away after years of health struggles, his body finally giving out after decades of punishment. While the exact cause of death remains unconfirmed, those familiar with his situation noted that heart problems caused by his lifestyle had to be the main contributing factor. His passing marked the end of a life defined by extraordinary physical achievements and equally extraordinary physical suffering. The speed of Dynamite. Kid's decline remains one of the most sobering aspects of his story. In just a decade, he went from revolutionizing wrestling to being physically unable to perform. In another decade, he was confined to a wheelchair. The man who had inspired countless wrestlers with his athletic brilliance spent the last 20 years of his life as a case study in the dangers of pushing beyond human limitations. As Dynamite Kid's personal story took a tragic turn, his in-ring innovations were spreading throughout wrestling in ways he could never have imagined. Long after Dynamite Kid could no longer enter a wrestling ring, his influence continued to grow. Walk into any major wrestling event today, and you'll see his technical legacy in action. Super kicks, diving headbutts, crisp German suplexes, and suicide dives that were once revolutionary are now standard moves performed by wrestlers who weren't even born during Dynamite's prime. This evolution didn't happen by accident. As Dynamite's health declined, wrestling fans traded VHS tapes of his matches with Tiger Mask and Bret Hart, studying them like sacred texts. Young wrestlers in training facilities across the world watch these tapes obsessively, trying to capture even a fraction of Dynamite's intensity and precision. The style that promoters once considered too physically demanding for mainstream wrestling was being adopted by an entire generation of performers. The most direct link in this technical lineage was Chris Benoit. The similarities between Benoit and Dynamite Kid were unmistakable. The same compact muscular build, the same intensity, the same technical precision. This wasn't coincidental. Benoit openly told others that he was heavily influenced and idolized Dynamite Kid. He adopted Dynamite's diving headbutt as his signature move and incorporated many elements of Dynamite's style into his own performances. Through Benoit, Dynamite's influence spread throughout American wrestling in the 1990s and early 2000s. Wrestlers like Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Perry Saturn all showed elements of Dynamite's approach: the stiff strikes, the technical sequences, the realistic selling. The style that had once been considered too intense for American audiences was now creating some of the most acclaimed matches in WCW and WWE. In Japan, Dynamite's influence was even more profound. The junior heavyweight style that he helped establish with Tiger Mask became the foundation for entire promotions. Wrestlers like Jushin Thunder Liger, Ultimo Dragon, and the Great Sasuke built on what Dynamite had started, creating a high-flying, hard-hitting style that combined technical excellence with spectacular aerial moves. Japanese fans, who had witnessed Dynamite's revolutionary matches firsthand, embraced this evolution of his approach. The technical lineage continued into the modern era. Bryan Danielson, known in WWE as Daniel Bryan, studied Dynamite's matches extensively and incorporated elements of his style into his own performances. The striking precision, the submission expertise, and the intensity that made Dynamite's matches feel real are all visible in Danielson's work. Like Dynamite, Danielson proved that smaller wrestlers could deliver main event performances based on technical skill rather than size or flashy character work. Kenny Omega represents yet another branch of this technical family tree. The spread of Dynamite's influence wasn't limited to established wrestling powerhouses like Japan and America. In the UK, his home country that had initially been slow to recognize his brilliance, a new generation of technical wrestlers emerged in the 2000s who studied his matches and adopted elements of his style. Wrestlers like Zack Sabre Jr. and Pete Dunne brought technical precision and intensity that clearly showed Dynamite's influence. Modern wrestling matches frequently display moments that could be taken directly from Dynamite's playbook. The documentary about his life makes this clear, noting that everyone took steroids in the locker rooms of the 80s. Today, major wrestling organizations have implemented wellness policies that include drug testing, medical support, and education about the dangers of performance-enhancing substances. WWE, the company that employed Dynamite as a British Bulldog, now has comprehensive wellness programs that would have been unimaginable during his time there. Wrestlers undergo regular medical screenings. Substance abuse is addressed through treatment rather than punishment. Performance-enhancing drugs that were once considered standard are now explicitly banned. These changes didn't happen overnight, but emerged gradually as the industry confronted the human cost of its previous practices. The physical toll of wrestling is now discussed openly rather than hidden. Documentaries, podcasts, and interviews regularly feature conversations about the challenges wrestlers face in maintaining their health. This transparency represents a major shift from Dynamite's era, when the physical sacrifices were hidden from public view. By acknowledging these challenges, the industry has created space for wrestlers to prioritize their well-being without being considered weak. We can see Dynamite's cautionary influence in how today's performers approach career longevity. In his time, few wrestlers thought seriously about what their bodies would be like after retirement. The focus was entirely on short-term success. Modern wrestlers are more likely to consider the long view, making adjustments to their styles to extend their careers and preserve their quality of life after wrestling. Many directly cite the examples of performers like Dynamite Kid as motivation for this approach. The industry's handling of injuries shows perhaps the clearest evolution. In the 1980s, wrestlers often returned to action shortly after suffering serious injuries, as Dynamite did following his back injury. Today, recovery protocols are much more stringent. Wrestlers are given time to heal properly, rather than being rushed back into action. Medical clearance procedures are formalized rather than casual. These changes reflect hard lessons learned from watching performers like Dynamite sacrifice their future health for short-term gain. Like and subscribe for 100 years of luck. Until next time.